Dorian stared out the bus window, watching as the landscape changed from crowded city streets to quiet suburban roads lined with nearly identical houses. Lincoln Heights, Missouri. Another new town, another new school, another fresh start. Or at least, that's what his mom kept telling him. He knew better. Fresh starts didn't really exist for people like him, not in places like this. This wasn't the first time Dorian had been the new kid. He'd moved plenty of times before, packing up his life, switching schools, stepping into classrooms where everyone already had their friends and routines. But something about this move felt different. Maybe it was the way his mother had looked at him before they left, hopeful but worried. Maybe it was the way his uncle had clapped a firm hand on his shoulder before he got on the bus and told him, "Keep your head up, boy. Stay in control." That was the thing about his uncle. He was always talking about control, about knowing when to walk away, when to fight back, when to let people say what they wanted, and when to shut them up. Dorian had spent years listening, nodding, internalizing. He had learned the lessons, but that didn't make it any easier. The bus slowed as they reached Ridgemont High. The name alone sounded like the kind of place where kids drove cars their parents bought them and played the same sports their dads had played before them. Dorian stepped off the bus, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and immediately felt it. The shift in the air. It wasn't obvious. No one said anything outright, but he saw it. The way conversations quieted when he walked past. The subtle double takes. The way some kids looked at him just long enough to make it clear they had noticed him before quickly looking away, pretending they hadn't. Dorian had seen this before. His uncle always told him that some people stare because they were curious, some because they were cautious, and some because they had already decided who he was before he even opened his mouth. He didn't care which category these people fell into. He wasn't here to impress anyone. The teachers, at least, were polite, almost overly so. Their smiles were too tight, their voices careful, measured, like they were making sure to say the right things. One of them, a woman with thin glasses and a clipboard, greeted him as if she had been practicing her tone in a mirror. "Welcome to Ridgemont, Dorian. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Her words were friendly, but there was something else behind them. Caution, maybe, or expectation. Dorian simply nodded. He wasn't planning on needing anything. The first few periods passed without much issue. He took his seat, answered when called on, kept his head down, and focused on the work. That was always the plan. Blend in, don't stand out, don't give people a reason to look twice. But even when he wasn't trying to draw attention, he could still feel it. By lunchtime, the weight of all those stares had settled in, an itch beneath his skin. He stepped into the cafeteria, tray in hand, scanning the room for a place to sit. Most tables were already filled, groups of students locked in conversations that didn't include him. A few glanced in his direction, whispering something to each other before turning away. Same old story. Then, he spotted a table near a guy who was too busy scrolling through his phone to care. Good enough. Dorian started toward it, setting his tray down. "You lost." The voice cut through the noise around him. Dorian turned his head slightly. A blonde kid, maybe an inch shorter than him, but sitting with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his life, leaned back in his chair. His smirk was easy, relaxed, the kind that came from knowing he had an audience. Around him, a few other guys watched, amusement flickering in their expressions. Dorian exhaled slowly, keeping his face unreadable. "Didn't know I needed a map." The blonde kid chuckled, shaking his head. "Just making sure. Not a lot of new faces around here." There was hesitation in his voice, an unspoken weight behind his words. "Not a lot of new faces like yours." Dorian heard it loud and clear. He met the kid's stare, unreadable. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk widened, but there was something else behind it now. Amusement, interest, maybe something else. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man." Dorian didn't respond. He just sat down, picked up his fork, and started eating. He had a feeling that wouldn't be the last conversation they had. The first day of lunch at Ridgemont High was just as Dorian had expected. Crowded, noisy, and full of people who already had their own groups, their own places. He moved through the cafeteria, tray in hand, scanning for a spot that wasn't completely closed off to him. Most tables were full, the students engaged in conversations that didn't include him. Some barely acknowledged his presence. Others whispered, just loud enough for him to know they were talking about him. He didn't let it bother him. It never did. Then he heard it. "You lost." The voice was casual, almost lazy, but there was something sharp underneath. Dorian turned his head slightly. A blonde kid sat with his legs stretched out under the table, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. His smirk was easy, confident, the kind that belonged to someone who had never once been put in his place. Around him, a few other guys watched, some grinning, some just waiting. Dorian recognized the type immediately. Bryce Tanner. He didn't need to hear the name to know it. Every school had one. The golden boy. The one who walked down the halls like he had been born to be there. The one whose friends laughed at all his jokes, whose teachers excused his behavior, whose parents had enough money to make sure nothing ever really touched him. Dorian didn't react. He just let out a slow breath. "Didn't know I needed a map." Bryce chuckled, shaking his head. "Just making sure. Not a lot of new faces around here. Not a lot of faces like yours." He didn't say it out loud, but he didn't have to. Dorian held his gaze for a second, then shrugged. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk widened just a bit, but there was something behind it now. Amusement, curiosity, and something else, something more dangerous. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man," Bryce said. Dorian didn't answer. He just sat down and started eating. He wasn't interested in playing whatever game Bryce was setting up. But Bryce wasn't the type to let things go unnoticed. The first few days, it was just little things. Whispers in the hallway, just loud enough for Dorian to hear. Didn't know they let guys like him in here. "How long do you think he'll last?" It wasn't new. Dorian had heard it before. He ignored it. Then came a shoulder check. He was at his locker, swapping out books between classes, when someone bumped into him hard enough to slam his shoulder against the metal. The sound echoed down the hall. "Oops," Bryce said, his voice dripping with fake innocence. "Didn't see you there." Dorian didn't react. Didn't give him what he wanted. He just grabbed his notebook, shut his locker, and walked away. Kept his movements slow, controlled. Bryce laughed. "You're quiet, huh? That's cool. Real cool." Dorian didn't look back. The second time, it was in the cafeteria. Dorian was heading toward the trash cans, tray in hand, when a foot shot out in front of him. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. He felt the sudden jolt as his balance shifted forward, but he caught himself before he could fall. Laughter erupted. Bryce held up his hands. "Relax, man. It was just a joke." Dorian still didn't react. Didn't look at him. Just stepped over Bryce's foot and kept walking. More laughter. Someone muttered, "Too easy." His jaw clenched. He could hear his uncle's voice in his head, steady, firm. A lion doesn't flinch when the hyenas bark. Dorian exhaled. Let go. But Bryce wasn't done. Because the third time wasn't a joke. The school day had come to an end, and the halls were already clearing out. Dorian had spent the last hour in the library, finishing up an assignment, taking his time. He had no reason to rush home. His mother wouldn't be back from work for a few more hours, and he preferred the quiet anyway. As he stepped outside, the air was crisp, the parking lot nearly empty. Most students had already left, their cars pulling away minutes ago. The few that remained were either waiting for rides or lingering in small groups, lost in their own conversations. Dorian adjusted the strap of his backpack and started toward the sidewalk. Then he heard it. "Hey, new guy!" A voice called out from behind him, sharp and familiar. He barely had time to register it before something smacked against his back. Hard. The impact sent a cold splash across his hoodie, the sudden chill making him tense. He stopped, exhaling slowly as the sensation settled in. Soda. He glanced down, watching the dark liquid seep into the fabric, droplets still dripping onto the pavement. Ice cubes scattered around his feet. Laughter followed. Dorian turned, slow and controlled. Bryce stood a few feet away, still holding his empty cup, the last few drops spilling from his fingers. Nick, Kyle, and a couple of others stood behind him, grinning like they had just watched the funniest thing they'd seen all day. Bryce smirked, tilting his head. "Damn, my bad. Didn't see you there." The words were so obviously fake, so deliberately mocking, that Dorian could feel the heat rise in his chest. He inhaled through his nose, steadied himself. He had walked away before. He had ignored the whispers, the shoves, the so-called jokes. He could do it again. So he turned. He started to walk past Bryce, leaving it behind. But Bryce wasn't done. A hand shoved hard against Dorian's shoulder, stopping him mid-step. It wasn't playful. It wasn't light. It was forceful. A challenge. Dorian took a slow breath, jaw tightening. The parking lot had gone quiet. People were watching now. Not just Bryce's friends, but others, students who had been on their way to their cars, students who had nothing to do with this, but had stopped anyway, because they knew what was coming. Nick snickered. "Look at him. Bet he's scared." Bryce grinned, stepping closer. "What's the matter, man? Got nothing to say?" Dorian didn't answer. He just let his backpack slip off his shoulder, dropping it onto the pavement beside him. And that was when everything shifted. The laughter faded. Bryce's smirk twitched, just for a second. He wasn't expecting that. "Oh," he let out a low chuckle. "You want to play now?" He barely finished the sentence before Dorian moved. Fast, a sharp left feint, just enough to make Bryce flinch. Then the real hit, a right hook, straight to the ribs. The impact was solid, precise. The kind of punch that wasn't just thrown, it was placed, aimed, executed with intention. Bryce let out a choked gasp as the air rushed from his lungs. His body folded, his knees nearly buckling. But Dorian wasn't done. A pivot, an uppercut, perfect form. Bryce's head snapped back, and for a second, it looked like he might recover, might stay on his feet. Then his legs gave out. He hit the pavement hard. Silence. The watching students stood frozen, expressions shifting from amusement to shock. Nick and the others stared, mouths slightly open. None of them moved. None of them laughed. Dorian adjusted his hoodie, rolling his shoulders back as he steadied his breathing. Bryce groaned, curling onto his side, coughing. Dorian looked down at him, voice calm. "You done?" Bryce didn't answer, didn't even try. Dorian glanced at the others. Anyone else? Nobody spoke. He picked up his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and turned away. He didn't look back, didn't check to see if Bryce was still on the ground. Didn't care if anyone had their phones out, if this would spread by tomorrow morning. Because in that moment, it didn't matter. He had walked away before, but this time, they had made sure he wouldn't. By the next morning, everyone knew. Dorian didn't have to check his phone to confirm it. He could feel it the moment he stepped onto campus. The way conversations paused as he passed. The way heads turned, whispers spreading like wildfire through the hallways. Some students glanced at him with wide-eyed respect, others with something closer to fear. And then there were the ones who looked at him like they had already made up their minds. Bryce wasn't at school. That didn't surprise Dorian. A hit like that in front of half the parking lot wasn't something a guy like him bounced back from overnight. Nick and Kyle, the ones who had laughed the loudest the day before, kept their distance. They didn't make eye contact when he walked by. They didn't try to test him, but that didn't mean it was over. Because there was always something else. As Dorian moved through the cafeteria at lunch, he could feel the shift in the air. People whispered as he passed. Some nodded at him, like they suddenly respected him now. Some younger kids, freshmen who hadn't even spoken to him before, acted like he was some kind of legend. And then there were the others. Didn't know new guy had hands, someone muttered from a nearby table. Bryce had it coming, another voice added. He's not even coming back for a week. Dorian ignored it. He wasn't here to be a hero. He wasn't looking for validation. Then, as he sat down, he heard something else. He's just another violent thug. The words were soft, but not soft enough. His head turned slightly. A couple of girls at a nearby table. One of them, a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression like she smelled something bad, quickly looked away when she realized he had heard her. Dorian clenched his jaw, stomach twisting. That was the thing about moments like this. It didn't matter that Bryce had been the one to push him. That Bryce had been the one who wanted a reaction. It didn't matter that he had walked away again and again until there was nowhere left to walk. Someone would always find a way to twist it. To them, he wasn't a kid who defended himself. He was dangerous. A problem. It sat heavy in his chest. He'd spent years training. Years learning how to control himself. Years walking away when he wanted to do anything, but that wasn't weakness. That was strength. So why did it feel like no matter what choice he made, people had already decided who he was? The thought lingered in his mind long after lunch, weighing on him as the day went on. By the time the last bell rang, He was more than ready to leave. But as he stepped out of the gym after practice, a voice called out, "Dorian, got a minute?" He turned. Coach Harrison stood near the track, arms crossed, watching him. Dorian hesitated, not really in the mood for a lecture. But something in the coach's expression made him stop. They walked a few steps away from the gym, standing near the field where the football team was finishing up practice. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. "I heard what happened," Coach said. "Figured you had your reasons." Dorian nodded, but didn't say anything. Coach studied him for a moment. "You a fighter?" Dorian shrugged. "Been boxing since I was a kid." Coach let out a low whistle. "Yeah, that much was obvious." He paused. "Let me ask you something. Did that fight change anything?" Dorian frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Coach crossed his arms. "You think Bryce learned something? You think the rest of them did?" Dorian exhaled, running a hand over his head. He already knew the answer. Bryce wasn't the type to reflect. Some people now respected him. Some feared him. And some, no matter what he did, would always see him the way they wanted to. Coach nodded, like he could see the thoughts running through Dorian's head. "Thing is, people like Bryce don't really lose. Not in a way that sticks. He'll come back. He'll run his mouth. The cycle starts again." He paused. "But you're different. You have control." Dorian frowned slightly. "What are you saying?" Coach tilted his head toward the field. "I've been telling the boxing coach to send me a few kids for wrestling. You ever thought about putting all that skill to better use?" Dorian blinked. "Wrestling?" Coach grinned. "Look, I know you can handle yourself. That much is obvious. But there's a difference between winning a fight and learning how to own your power." He held Dorian's gaze. "I've seen too many kids like you get boxed into a reputation they never wanted. You already proved you're not to be messed with. Now, prove there's more to you than that." Dorian didn't answer right away. For so long, fighting had been about survival, about standing his ground. But the way Coach was looking at him, the way he spoke, it wasn't about proving something. It was about being more. Dorian sat on the edge of his bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes locked on the old pair of boxing gloves sitting on his desk. They were worn, the leather cracked in places, the laces frayed from years of use. His uncle's gloves, the same ones he had trained with when he was a kid, back when every lesson was about control, about knowing when to throw a punch and when to hold back. He had spent years listening, nodding, internalizing. And for the most part, he had done what his uncle taught him. He had learned restraint, learned to let words roll off his back, learned to walk away even when his blood boiled. And yet, the one time he didn't, this was what people saw. They didn't see the restraint he had shown before. They didn't see the days, the weeks of biting his tongue, of keeping his hands in his pockets. They saw a fight in a parking lot. They saw bruised knuckles and a boy on the ground. Some saw strength. Some saw a threat. He let out a slow breath, leaning back against the wall. Bryce would come back. Dorian knew that. Guys like him always did. And maybe next time, he'd be smarter. Maybe next time, he'd pick a fight in a place where there weren't so many witnesses. And if it wasn't Bryce, it would be someone else. There was always another Bryce. But that wasn't what bothered Dorian the most. What got under his skin, what wouldn't let him go, was the way people looked at him now. Like he was exactly what they had expected him to be. Like the story had already been written for him. He thought about what Coach Harrison had said. There's a difference between winning a fight and owning your power. Dorian ran a hand over his face, exhaling. He wasn't sure what owning his power meant, but he knew one thing for certain. He didn't want other people deciding who he was. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Coach's number. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. Then he sent the message. "I'm in." The reply came less than a minute later. "Good choice. Practice starts Monday." Dorian set the phone down, looking back at the gloves. For the first time in a long time, a different kind of fire burned in his chest. Not the kind that came from anger, from the need to prove something. This was something else. This was a choice. Because real strength wasn't just about knowing when to fight. It was about knowing what you were fighting for. Life is full of choices. Sometimes, the hardest one isn't whether to fight back or walk away. It isn't about proving your strength to someone who doubts you. It's about deciding who you want to be. Dorian made his choice. Not just in that parking lot, not just in that moment when his fist connected with Bryce's ribs. He made his choice when he realized that strength isn't about who hits harder, who stands taller, or who wins a fight. Real strength is about control, about knowing that you don't have to be what the world expects you to be. And now it's your turn. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand your ground? A moment where you had to decide whether to fight, to walk away, or to prove yourself in a different way? What does strength mean to you? Let's talk about it. Share your story in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of expectation pressing down on your shoulders, hit that subscribe button. Because life is about choices. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make your own. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.